All right, welcome everyone. Just give us a moment as we get situated. Let's see. Great. Nora's a co-host.
Wonderful. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. We're going to get started in just a minute. We're going to give it just 2 minutes and then we'll get started, everybody.
Hi everyone. So just because of the size and volume, tonight we actually are going to mute the chat. So don't be alarmed if you stop seeing anything coming in. It's just going to be a pause on the chat.
All right. I think that we are good to get started. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for deciding to spend your Thursday evening with us. We are so excited to spend an hour, a little bit over an hour, talking about disinformation on the internet, what it means in the context of our reproductive rights, in the context of abortion access, especially in this political national moment that we're in today. Allison, do you want to go ahead and share your screen and we can get started? Awesome. So you are in the right place today. If you signed up for a training that is part of the Women's March Digital Defenders training program, today we are actually collaborating with NARAL, who are our partners on many issues, but today in particular around disinformation, around abortion, and reproductive rights generally. So we can move to the next slide. So what we're up to today, we're going to go ahead and introduce ourselves and talk a little bit about how we're using Zoom today together. And then we'll move into talking about Digital Defenders, which is, again, the Women's March training series and program that you will be onboarded to after this training is over. And then we'll talk about abortion access generally. What are we seeing on the internet? How is this issue politicized and organized around online? And what can we really do to intervene in some of this narrative and be able to push our own values forward? Of a short section for Q&A, and then we'll move into next steps and onboarding.
Hi everyone. Just a quick update on, oh, is there a little feedback? Here, let me exit out. Just a quick update on Zoom. I know we've all been doing this for a year, but just so you know, the chat is closed. So if you are confused as to why things aren't popping up, don't worry. The chat is just only available in a Q&A format. So you'll see at the bottom, there's a little Q&A, it's 2 quote bubbles, and there you can type your question. So from there, I just want everyone to know that if your question is dismissed, it's not because we're ignoring you, it's because we want you to know that someone else has asked it and we've already answered it. And then you can also look in the answer section and maybe your question has already been answered. So feel free to just scroll through it. And that's the only reason the chat is turned off. So don't worry. And we know that the march is on Saturday and that's really, really exciting. So please try and keep your questions remaining in the digital defender sphere. Go to womensmarch.com if you have any Women's March questions for the rally on Saturday. But other than that, thanks for being here.
Thank you, Allison. So hi, my name is Noor. I am the Director of Digital Advocacy at the Women's March, pronouns she, hers, and I am based in Washington, D.C. And I'm going to turn it over to Allison.
Hi everyone, I'm Allison. I run Digital Defenders with Noor. I make the toolkits with Noor, the graphics that you're going to be seeing later today. Some of you have already seen them. We have a new website, which is really exciting, where you can see every graphic that ever existed, videos. It's really, really exciting that we have one complete place for you. And I'm also based in DC.
Hi, everyone. My name is Gabriella Rico. I am a research coordinator at NARAL, and I use she, her pronouns. I am super, super, super excited to be here with Women's March. I think the Digital Defenders program is so incredible. And I'm just so happy to be speaking to you all about what we're kind of seeing around disinformation, around abortion, and how we can structure our interventions and make sure that accurate information is reaching people. So thank you all for being here.
Great. So now we're actually going to get started with some level setting of why digital defenders, why abortion defenders, why are we here and what's our purpose? All right, so right off the bat, why are we here? So all of us are here because we are having these relationships through the internet, throughout social media. And we know that these platforms can be difficult to regulate, can be difficult to navigate, especially if there's no real rule book. So we're trying to make it a source of good, a medium where we can have actual political discourse that's beneficial to our movement and to our cause, that we unite over shared values. So connecting with your long lost aunt, connecting with someone you met at a concert 3 years ago, using these platforms as a reason to push our own political discourse and agenda. And so we also want to make sure that with digital defenders, we are increasing the visibility of accurate information. So what does that mean? We see a lot of disinformation, whether we know it or not, on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, even YouTube comments where it's not as direct. We really see all of this information thrown at us, and we want to make it more normalized that correct and factual information is what's everywhere. And so, like I mentioned, the internet is a high stakes playground. We really have no rules for regulation for Facebook, as we know, as Instagram, which is owned by Facebook. These platforms, unfortunately, really make their own rules. And so we need to be careful about the kind of information that we share, because it really does sway political discourse. And of course, the number one thing with digital defenders that's so important that we already do normally online is being ourselves in our own unique voice. So while we'll give you a toolkit later, but you'll see, we want you to be able to tailor it to how you would speak to your aunt or your friend from a concert or your mom on Facebook. And so I'm just going to share a few of our strategies with you. So number one, I just want everyone to remember that we are training everyday people. So Gabriella, Nora, and I are just normal everyday people who have Instagram regularly and interact with our people and our friends regularly. And so we're using our own platforms to like organically push back against right-wing narratives that infringe on our rights every day, and we just scroll past it sometimes and don't even think about it. And so we really want to reframe how we're doing this kind of work. So rather than engaging with a troll in a comment, we want to be on the offensive. There's nothing wrong with being on the defensive and constantly having to defend reproductive rights, but we want to have original and unique stories in our own uplifting and retweeting, in our own like narratives in our own Facebook posts. We want to make these pro-abortion, pro-reproductive rights graphics as widespread as possible, as opposed to being drowned out by this very loud but small right-wing narrative that abortions are unsafe, that reproductive healthcare isn't healthcare. And so in the same vein, we want to affirm that there are a lot of people out there who actually don't know everything, and that's totally okay. Again, the three of us are very normal people who happen to do a lot of research on this, and now we're not experts in abortion rights, but we understand that when we see disinformation on the internet, how to call it out and what to do about it. And that's why we're all here, because we're normal people on the internet. In the same vein as well, affirming is really, really important when it comes to seeing a tweet about someone sharing their own personal narrative. You want to be able to uplift and retweet that. You want to engage the most with factual and truthful storytelling. And so in this, again, shared values are so important. We want to make sure that everyone is sharing stories that are important to them, because it's really easy to just drop in a link when a troll is being difficult and just state, like, well, 70% of the United States is pro-abortion. And like, that's nice, that's helpful, it's catchy, it's interesting, but you really need that pull of, why does your aunt care about this? Why does your mom care about this? Why does your first grade teacher care about this? And that's why it's really important to connect over shared values. In addition to that, it can be really toxic on the internet to talk to people who act like they're experts and know everything. And we want to make our tweets, our Instagram posts, our stories as accessible as possible to everybody. We want to make sure that the language that we use is accessible to everyone in terms of, dropping a Karl Marx like quote in the middle of Instagram is so unhelpful to our movement. We want to make sure that we are making it so, again, that your first grade teacher and your mom and your aunt can totally understand what you're saying and what you're describing to them. And so it has to also be a positive experience for them. They will have to be able to read the things that you're writing and feel like, I connect with that. I understand that. And so last but not least, I know a ton of us, I'm sure, have engaged with trolls in the past, and like it can feel really like invigorating, but the number one thing is never ever let a falsehood go unchallenged. And that's really important when you're scrolling through Facebook, scrolling through Twitter mindlessly, that if you see something, you report it, you do something about it. You don't just leave it up, because when you don't engage with it, someone else will see it. And the more you engage with it incorrectly, you just push something further, you push disinformation further. So it's really important that we call things out and nip it in the bud the second we see it.
Thank you so much, Allison. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time just talking about misinformation and disinformation. We can move to the next slide. So if you're like me, you have probably heard these two phrases a lot, especially over the past 4 or 5 years. I would say that I didn't really know that there was a difference between misinformation or disinformation, or even an overlap, or that these terms meant different things, until maybe 2 or 3 years ago, when I started really digging into how these universes operate, what it means for the internet, what it means for social media. So our friends over at the organization Media Matters gave us these definitions that I think are really useful, that we wanted to share with you. So people use these terms interchangeably, but they actually are really different in their intentionality. So an example of misinformation, right? So on Facebook, you might copy paste a warning from a friend. That is like a chain letter. It's like, okay, if you don't post this in the next 24 hours, all of your Facebook memories are going to be deleted and your account's going to be hacked. You might have seen something like that around, or you might have seen something that is share this photo, of something that's wonderful, or this interesting scientific development, something that may not evidently have a negative, harmful motivation, but is still being spread, right? It's still inaccurate. So that's what I think of when I think of misinformation. When I think of disinformation, it's something that's intentionally false. There is a motivation involved. So an example of this could be, sort of the most that I hear about disinformation is in the context of elections, in the context of 2016 in Russia, right? That's like a very clear example of when fake news websites, are pretending to be representative of communities or governments, or Facebook pages that claim to be local news. Another example would be, oftentimes you see mainstream media or media outlets also make some really clear decisions about putting out this information as well, being, making decisions about what to cover and how to cover it. So the easiest way to think about it is that misinformation might be a picture, a doctored photo maybe of a dolphin swimming in the Venice Canal, being like, okay, during the pandemic, the environment really healed, and now we're seeing dolphins swim in this heavily polluted canal, right? That's something that made us happy. We're like, oh, this is really great. Like, here's some silver lining, right? But disinformation is a lot more like a coordinated campaign, and attacks that actually have some thinking and some collaboration, and some actual work go into putting that disinformation out. So today we're going to be dealing a lot more with the second, with disinformation, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't also be cognizant of misinformation, because that's often where disinformation starts, right? With one thing that goes viral and then catches on and then ends up becoming a part of a coordinated campaign. So we can move to the next one. So I want to be really, really clear that as individuals, as consumers of social media, as users of social media, a lot that happens on the internet, especially with disinformation, especially with right-wing narratives, is oftentimes something that is out of our general control, right? Like you're talking about hundreds and thousands of people that are all over the internet, all over the world, that are seeing lots and lots of things and repeating lots and lots of things. So as much as we can take some ownership over what we're seeing, at the end of the day, this is part of a much bigger fight, right? Against big tech, against social media platforms that are purposefully feeding into and not doing anything to really stop some of this dangerous narrative that actually results in some real offline harm, such as real right-wing violence that we see on the ground, right? So there's lots of organizations, including NARAL, including Women's March, including a lot of other organizations that are working hard to also dismantle and hold big tech accountable for some of these things. All that to say, there are still some things that we can do to help with this, right? To help with not repeating disinformation as those individual users. So some of the tips that we wanted to share, number one, is that you want to think through, like, cognitively, people are more likely to change their mind if you give them something else to latch onto, right? So starting with what you see at the bottom here, you want to replace inaccurate information with something else. So that's something else is what we'll be training you to do. Sometimes that might be an article. Sometimes that might be a link to an organization that you trust that is doing some real good work on the issue, right? But sometimes you might not have any of those things, and sometimes the something else you're giving people to latch onto is a value, or it's an alternative scenario, or it's like, do you really have to think about the world in that way? What if you thought about this instead, right? So that's something else is really what the gist of this training is and what we're really going to be focusing on together. Something else is, if you aren't really sure about what's going on, there's way less harm in sharing something than sharing something that's inaccurate. So some of the things that you should think about is, is it too good to be true? Who stands to gain from the news? We all need really good news in these very bleak and dark times, and we all want to see news that confirm what we already believe or what we want to believe. So something you might want to do is try looking into it more. Something that I do often is I take a sentence that's in an article and I just pop that into Google search. And that phrase, if it shows up in different places, you can see, okay, this was written by this author, this was published elsewhere. You can do a little bit more research and trust your gut on some of these things. A second thing is, like, if you're seeing a lot of text, right? If you're seeing a lot of just blocks of text that are up on a screen with no links, no firsthand resources, and they're making a very strong claim, you might want to dig into that a little bit more. It's like, okay, they're, claiming that the world is 7 degrees higher than it was last year. That's interesting and scary. Let's see where they got this from, right? So it's not always as drastic as that, but you do want to look into that a little bit more, especially if they're putting out some seriously compelling facts that don't have any basis or research behind them. And then again, as I mentioned, you do want to ask yourself, what do I stand to gain by also sharing this if I'm not 100% sure about it? So trust your gut. If you're not sure, try following some of these tips. And if at the end of the day it makes you uncomfortable, don't share it. And then I would say, Allison mentioned this already, but there are a lot of report mechanisms. I won't say that they always work. These are like real life people that are moderators, that are people that are screening these things. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. So I wouldn't recommend this as the first thing you do, but if it's something that you feel like doing, that is an option that you have as well. But again, I would not, expect that it would result in something immediate, or something at all for that matter. So we can move to the next slide. I think there was one before this, Allison. So just want to give like a quick review of what we're going to be talking about today. So Allison mentioned this already, but something that is key to our program is talking about how we're challenging hate and misinformation, disinformation online, and what you can actually do in terms of giving people that something else to latch onto, right? What do you follow up with? So we're going to be digging into that a little bit. Is what are the values that you're introducing that counter some of these narratives that are really dangerous, and are spreading falsehoods online. We also want to talk about our values. We're not coming in as robots. We're not machines. We're real people. What are the things we care about? What are the things that compel us to stand up for justice? What are the things that compel us to reach out to somebody else and say, hey, I care about you enough and I care about this enough that I want to reach out to you and make sure that you know that this isn't entirely true, right? So all of that takes a little bit of identification of what our values are and being able to state them and what that means, across different issues. Also going to be talking about a lot of different language that comes to play in our advocacy, right? There are words that we should say, and there's some words that we probably shouldn't repeat. I will say that, especially with this specific issue and talking about reproductive rights, there's a lot that I had to unlearn that I didn't even know about, right? I was like, I didn't know that that's something that the anti-choice movement came up with and specifically used. I had no idea. So we're going to be learning a little bit about that, and some words that you can use instead. And then finally, there's a lot about sort of what you can use to really push something that's different and bigger and bolder than just talking about abortion, right? It's like, what does abortion mean to people in terms of their autonomy, in terms of their decision, in terms of their freedom, in terms of being a person that's allowed to have these choices about what you're going to do with your body and your life, right? So every interaction that we talk about is also an opportunity to expand the conversation, to take it somewhere further, to really talk about what this means in a human rights context, right? So that's what we're going to be going into today. And with that, I will pass it over to Gabriella to talk a little bit more about the details.
Thank you, Nora and Allison, for that really good introduction. I think you guys touched on a lot of things that are super important and that we also tell our NARAL members when we're talking about disinformation. So just to kind of get into this next portion of the presentation, I'm going to be talking to you all a little bit about the current threats to abortion access and two really big ones. And then I'm going to go into about 5 of the different disinformation narratives that are really common right now about abortion online. So things that you might be encountering as you're trying to have these conversations. So we can just start off by talking about the current threats to abortion. And first, I will talk about SB 8 in Texas. I'm sure many of you have heard of this or it's on your radar, but just in case you haven't, SB 8 is essentially a draconian ban on abortion that went into effect in Texas on September 1st. And it bans abortion care as early as 6 weeks, which is before many people even know that they're pregnant. So why is this ban different? Why is this a really red alert moment for us? Well, first and foremost, it's really important to understand that this ban was specifically designed in order to evade judicial intervention that would stop it from going into effect. And that's exactly what happened when the Supreme Court declined to prevent it from going into effect at the beginning of September. So that means that right now I'm actually in Texas right now. So I've been here for about 30 days, and throughout this entire time, abortion has been almost entirely inaccessible to a lot of people. I will say, though, it is still technically legal, but legal doesn't always mean accessible. That's important to remember. So unlike other bans on abortion, SB 8 is different, and the way that they designed it was so this enforcement mechanism that they had could get around judicial intervention. And this enforcement mechanism basically allows any private citizen to sue literally any person who helps somebody access abortion care. That could be an Uber driver. That could be if you're a friend or family member. It could be if you're a clergy member who's counseling somebody on getting an abortion. You could get sued under this law. And if these vigilantes successfully sue somebody for, quote, aiding and abetting someone seeking abortion care in Texas, they can be provided with a reward of $10,000 or more. And obviously, this is bad enough on its own. But right now, we also know that at least 11 states have indicated that they're interested in passing near identical pieces of legislation. In fact, just last week, a copycat bill was introduced in Florida. So if you are in one of those states that's indicated they might be interested in passing a piece of legislation like this, it's really important to kind of start mobilizing and thinking about mobilizing early and in advance so that we can prevent this situation from happening in other places. So if we go to the next slide, one before, yeah. We can also talk about the upcoming Supreme Court case, which again, I'm sure is on many of your radars. This court case is called Dobbs versus Jackson's Women's Health Organization, and it is a case that is centered around Mississippi's ban on abortion at 15 weeks. This case is a direct challenge to Roe v. Wade, and it has the potential to end the constitutional right to abortion. Right now, we have a Supreme Court that is super hostile to abortion rights and reproductive freedom, so this is a really big threat. And if Roe falls, then 24 states would likely take action to prohibit abortion outright. We have 12 states that have what's known as a trigger ban, which would ban abortion automatically if Roe were overturned. And so that's why it's really, really crucial right now that we are encouraging Congress to pass the Women's Health Protection Act, which would protect the right to abortion throughout the United States. And the good news is that WIPA, as it's known, passed in the House last week. That was such a major victory for us. It is the first piece of proactive legislation to pass around abortion to pass Congress in decades. And so we really need to keep this momentum going and make sure that our senators know that WIPA needs to be a top priority going forward. And the last thing I want to mention here is that even though we want to protect Roe, it's really important to remember that Roe is the floor. It is not the ceiling. The right to abortion has been a right in name only for far too many people because of anti-choice restrictions. And those restrictions are disproportionately harming pregnant people that are already from historically marginalized communities. So passing WIPA is a critical first step to protecting abortion access, but it is really not the end of the fight, and we definitely need to go further. So before I get into these next slides, I want to give a quick little trigger warning. I'm going to be sharing some screenshots directly from anti-choice activists so that you can see what some of these disinformation narratives look like out in the wild and how they might look if you encounter them in your life. But just so you know, some of this language may be disturbing, so feel free to step away or put me on mute if you need some space. So that being said, let's jump into the first narrative, which is around co-opting, anti-choice activists co-opting feminism to push their extreme agenda. And I have two examples up here on screen so you can see what these claims typically look like. First, we have Students for Life claiming to be pro-woman, while it also advocates against women and pregnant people being able to make their own decisions around abortion care. And the second tweet is really disturbing. We have SBA List claiming that Texas shows how to be pro-woman after it passed the most extreme ban on abortion in the country that literally deputizes strangers to surveil women and pregnant people. In addition to these types of claims, antis will often also push a narrative that abortion is dangerous and violent, which is completely false. And I also want to point out in the Susan B. Anthony List tweet that you can see they're claiming that fake health centers are somehow a solution to forcing somebody to remain pregnant against their will. And just so that we're all aware, fake health centers or crisis pregnancy centers are centers that lie to pregnant people and coerce them out of seeking abortion care by directly targeting them with disinformation and other misleading claims. So the strategy here is really transparent. The anti-choice movement is trying to protect itself from valid criticism of how its policies are harming women by falsely claiming that they support women. And I also want to mention that this is something that they do as well around anti-racism. These activists will try and deflect attention from how their policies disproportionately harm Black people and communities of color by claiming that they are somehow anti-racist by passing abortion bans, which is obviously completely false. And you know, the whole point of this is that they know that people understand instinctively that abortion bans are attacks on women's and pregnant people's rights. So they're really just trying to seem less extreme by pretending that they care about women. So if we could go to the next slide. The second narrative that I want to talk about is co-opting science. And so obviously we have been in a pandemic for over a year now, over a year and a half. And there is a lot more of a public discussion around trusting the science and following the science. And the anti-choice movement is really trying to use this to their advantage. Before I talk about these examples, I want to state the reality, which is that the anti-choice movement is in no way pro-science. These are the same activists who have been on the forefront of spreading disinformation about COVID, vaccines, masks, and so much more. They're also early pioneers of what researchers like to call cloaked science, which is basically falsely claiming to have scientific evidence to support disinformation. That is not true. So you can see a couple of example tweets. We have Students for Life, Kristen Hawkins from Students for Life, falsely claiming that the media is rewriting science by reporting on the fact that the term heartbeat bill is medically inaccurate. And this is just a reminder, something Nora has already said, which is that we really should never be repeating the anti-choice movement's language or framing around these things. Especially, we should never, ever, ever use the phrase heartbeat ban. We want to say ban on abortion at 6 weeks before many people know that they are pregnant, because in reality, no heartbeat exists that early in pregnancy. And then we can see kind of the two main flavors of their claims around science here. We have students, SBA list, falsely claiming that science means we should ban abortion earlier in pregnancy. And then we have live action falsely claiming that science proves life begins at conception. So you can kind of see this difference in the goalposts that they're trying to set up. We have SBA list trying to be more moderate by proposing that around 15 weeks is when abortion should be banned. And then you have live action who is saying that conception is when life begins and there should never be abortion ever. So you can just see how they're kind of trying to manipulate this in whatever way that suits their goals. But what's ultimately important to remember is that these claims are not true. Anti-choice activists are really just trying to use them to muddy the waters of the public discussion around abortion. So if we can go to the next slide, we can talk about one of the narratives that I see the most often, and I'm sure many of you might have seen this as well. We have this abortion extremism narrative, which basically involves accusing anyone who does anything in support of abortion and reproductive freedom, calling them an extremist. It also involves fear-mongering about abortion, using medically inaccurate and completely misleading terms like abortion up to the moment of birth. And what this is all trying to do is to just make things sound really extreme, to make them really visceral. And you can see SBA list doing this when it comes to the Women's Health Protection Act. And really what they're trying to do is make it seem like pro-choice policies and just the pro-choice movement in general is out of touch with public opinion. That way they can kind of try to frame their restrictions and policies as somehow reasonable. And also they just make it seem like the debate around abortion is kind of like a 50-50 thing, when in reality, way more people support what they would call abortion extremism than supporting these anti-choice policies. So they just really want to make people feel like their opinion is out of the norm. We go to the next slide. I want to talk about this one because it kind of just pulls tactics from all three of the narratives that we just discussed. And for context, the anti-choice movement has been engaged in a really long-term disinformation campaign around medication abortion. And this is something that they are really continuing to ramp up right now. So for one example, after Texas passed SB 8, it actually also passed a bill that would limit medication abortion access to extremely early in pregnancy, far before it's medically necessary to even do so. And that's just because this is another way that they're trying to push abortion access out of reach for people. Anti-choice activists will try to justify these medically unnecessary restrictions by falsely claiming that medication abortion is dangerous, but that really could not be further from the scientific and medical evidence. Medication abortion has been in use in the US for over 20 years, and medical experts overwhelmingly agree that it is a safe, common, and effective procedure, and that the current restrictions are medically unnecessary. But that is not stopping the anti-choice movement. So why are they pushing so much disinformation? Well, first of all, they really know that medication abortion is going to play a huge role in the future of abortion access, because it can make abortion more accessible to people regardless of where they're located or their income. And they also just don't want people to be able to access medication abortion easily, because that would really limit their ability to harass patients and doctors outside of clinics. So they're really doubling down on this disinformation campaign. And it's something that you will probably see as you're trying to engage in this space and this activism more. And finally, I want to go to the last one, and medication abortion is actually a perfect lead-in to this next slide, because antis are actively engaging in a pressure campaign using these narratives around censorship and bias right now. So just for some context, the Center for Countering Digital Hate did some really excellent research that showed that Google and Facebook were profiting off of ads that featured disinformation about medication abortion. And after that report was released, Google actually blocked these ads, which is a super, super big win. But now anti-choice activists and politicians are engaging in a pressure campaign against Google for blocking their ads. And this really involves just falsely accusing fact checkers and tech platforms of bias and censorship against the anti-choice movement. And that's really a key strategy for them to ensure that they can keep their disinformation online. Like Noor said, these tech companies are already very bad at moderating this type of content and taking things down. And so they're even worse at it when they have these people kind of yelling at them, making these false claims that they're being censored. But I just want to emphasize here that researchers have shown there is absolutely no evidence that supports the claim that right-wing groups are disproportionately fact-checked or moderated online. And in fact, we know that some of the biggest accounts on platforms like Facebook blatantly spread disinformation about everything from abortion to election integrity to LGBTQ rights. So this is just not based in reality whatsoever. And I also just want to mention that antis will also do this around news outlets and medical organizations and any other kind of group that tries to fact check their blatant disinformation. They will just dismiss that by saying they're biased. And we're seeing that a lot because media outlets are really progressing in this area and they are refusing to parrot disinformation and use terms like heartbeat bill. So this is just something that is really good to be aware of as you get more involved in fighting back against disinformation, because this is a right-wing strategy. It's not just the anti-choice movement who does this, but it's the entire right wing. So now I'm going to take a sip of water. And then I'm going to get into the second part. And then I promise I will stop talking and pass it back over to Noor. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about counter messaging. So how can we respond to all of those disinformation narratives that I just talked about? So if we go to the next slide, we can start with a few things, and these are just things that you should keep in mind. Oh, sorry, Allison, I think we went back. Perfect, okay. So these are just a few things to keep in mind as we're doing, as you're making any response to any kind of anti-choice claim. So first and foremost, we really need to recenter the pregnant person. The anti-choice movement works really hard to erase pregnant people and just focus people's attention on babies and sometimes even wombs. And so erasing the pregnant person really means that the anti-choice movement doesn't have to answer for all of the justified reasons why somebody might need to seek abortion care. And whether those reasons are financial, health related, or the person is just not ready to be a parent, antis really want to erase those lived experiences because that's the only way that they can justify one size fits all bans on abortion. So it's just really important to remind people that restrictions and bans take away people's freedom to decide for themselves what option is best. The second thing is it's just important to talk about how bans like SB8 work in practice, and that's really part of centering the pregnant person, is just talking about how abortion bans are going to harm real people. A lot of people don't understand the full breadth of laws that exist. They don't understand how many restrictions there are. And so it's even more likely that they're also not aware of how many of these bans and restrictions work in practice and the harm that they cause. So, for example, bans like SB8 encourage strangers to spy on people, and they also isolate those people from their friends, their doctors, and their family, because they know that if they talk to somebody about wanting to get an abortion, that person could be legally liable and be sued by a stranger. So it's just isolating people. It's preventing them from making decisions and talking to their doctors and their families, and that's really harmful. It's also important to remind people that these bans and these restrictions are disproportionately impacting people who are already part of historically marginalized communities, and they are just creating huge barriers to access that prevent people from making the best decisions they can for their lives. And obviously there are certain people who, have the financial resources to be able to get around restrictions and travel, but that's not the reality for so many people. And then finally, this kind of goes back to talking about our values. We want to emphasize freedom versus control. People know and believe instinctually that politicians should not be able to control whether, when, and how somebody has a family. And abortion bans are about exactly that. They are about control. They have nothing to do with protecting life or protecting pregnant people. So we just need to remind people that decisions about a pregnancy should be made by the pregnant person in consultation with their doctors and loved ones free from political interference. That is a core part of being able to exercise our freedom. So if we go to the next slide, this goes back to something Nora was also saying, which is calling out the motives. When somebody is sharing something that you know is disinformation, it's really important to help them think about the motivations of the bad actors who are originating that disinformation. So reminds people that anti-choice activists spread disinformation because they do not have public opinion or medical expertise on their side. So they need to spread lies about abortion care that are really shocking and completely removed from reality in order to manipulate people into supporting their positions. Another thing that we can do is just remind people that the premier professional associations of doctors, including the American Medical Association and the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, do not support bans on abortion because those bans harm patients and they prevent doctors from providing the best care possible. So antis will often kind of respond to this by citing their own groups, such as the American Association of Pro-Life Obstetricians and Gynecologists, or groups like the Charlotte Lozier Institute, and they use these groups to justify these wildly misleading claims. So if that's happening, you can point out the fact that these groups were created with the purpose of legitimizing disinformation. They are not unbiased sources, and they are not on the level of ACOG or the AMA. And this also goes for anecdotal evidence, which is something that the anti-choice movement heavily relies on to make these claims. It should go without saying, but I'm going to say it anyway, that anecdotes are not equivalent to peer-reviewed research by medical experts. And finally, just going back to leaning into our values, it is not extreme to believe that politicians who know nothing about someone's life should not be able to dictate whether or not that person carries a pregnancy to term. And just remember that 8 in 10 Americans support the legal right to abortion. Our view is nothing extreme or out of the ordinary. It is what the vast majority of people believe in. And honestly, the anti-choice movement's position is the one that is very extreme and removed from what people believe in. So I have a couple more slides. And one thing that I just want to emphasize is it is really, really important to help people understand that we are in a pivotal moment for the future of abortion access. I already talked about the Supreme Court. I already talked about SB 8, but it's just important to help people understand that the anti-choice movement has been chipping away at abortion access for decades with restriction after restriction. And they are really getting close to creating a world that the vast majority of people do not support. So I'm going to get a little bit dark here and talk about their ideal world for a second, just so that we understand the stakes. But their ideal world is one in which strangers are encouraged to surveil pregnant people, a world where politicians are empowered to interfere with personal decisions about having a family, and doctors are prevented from providing patients with the healthcare that best suits their medical and personal needs. And they want a world where doctors and patients and pregnant people can be criminalized because of abortion. And this isn't on the slide, but I just want to give a spoiler alert that these people will not stop at banning abortion. They are coming after IVF, birth control, trans-inclusive care, and so much more. So they are really working very hard to create this world that is one of white, patriarchal control over people's bodies and restricting their fundamental freedoms to decide how to have a family, if they want to have a family, and when they're going to have a family. So finally, I will go to my last slide, which is obviously I just talked about a very, very dark reality, but that's also one that we can prevent from ever happening. And people like you speaking up and taking action is really what's going to make the difference in this moment. You know, because of SB 8, it's really sad, but it took SB 8 for a lot of people to wake up and recognize the world that the anti-choice movement is working towards creating. And that's why it's also a really important moment for us to talk proactively about the world that we want to create. So this goes back again to leaning into our values and being loud about what we're fighting for. And that's actually a really easy way to inoculate people against disinformation, because if they understand what our side stands for, they're much less likely to believe these like blatant lies and crazy I shouldn't say crazy, these wild statements that are coming from the anti-choice movement. So we need to tell people about the world that we want to create. And that's a world where everyone has the freedom to decide if, when, and how to have a family, regardless of where they live or how much money they earn. And it's a world where people respect other people's personal decisions about pregnancy and parenthood, and we're not judgmental about that. It's a world where people can get accurate, unbiased medical information to make informed decisions for themselves about what care is best. And then finally, it's a world where somebody who decides to seek abortion care has access to a safe, caring, and affordable clinic, and everybody who needs to do so is able to do so. So this is absolutely a world that so many people believe in, and it's a world that we can create if we keep fighting and we push back against this disinformation. So I just want to end before I pass it off to Noor by saying thank you again to you all for being a part of helping create this world by joining this training and by being proactive and fighting against these anti-choice lies and these disinformation narratives.
Thank you so, so much, Gabriella. And I know you felt like you spoke a lot, but we honestly needed everything that you told us and taught us. So we appreciate you. So just what we're going to spend a little bit of time on together for the rest of this is talking through, like, how do you actually stage your intervention when something is brought to your attention, when you stumble across mis or disinformation on your Facebook, on your Nextdoor forum, on Twitter, on the comments of an Instagram post. What do you actually do? So some of the steps that we're going to go through is, number one, you want to identify the comment you want to intervene in, right? It might be a standalone comment. It might be something that is expressed in a whole paragraph, but it's something that really sticks out. You want to evaluate what's actually behind the statement. What is the actual disinformation? What's the falsehood? Is it something that is talking about that is wrongly sort of depicting the impacts or the safety risks of abortion? Is it something that is that is a falsehood about how or when abortion is provided? Is this something about abortion clinics or how they're funded? You really want to think about what the falsehood is that you're really going to try to tackle. And then we're going to give you a manual that you'll be provided after this that helps you really structure and understand your response, and gives you multiple options that you can use. So some of the things that I do want to share is that you do want to think through how you're structuring your response, right? So again, if I am talking to somebody that I know, or maybe it's somebody that I know very well, or it might be somebody whose name I know because we went to school together, or somebody who I consider an acquaintance, I'm a little bit more comfortable acknowledging them. So I can be like, hi, Allison, hi, Gabriella, instead of just putting a response out into the ether, right? So you might want to start with some sort of hello, how are you? Or, hey, I just noticed your comment and I felt like I needed to respond. So it can be an acknowledgement of any sorts as long as it's one. The second one is tricky, right? So depending on what you're seeing out there, if it's something that is genuinely, based in misinformation and disinformation that somebody might be seeing or stumbling across, but is somebody who you know to do better, or somebody who you know wouldn't usually share something like that, you might want to affirm that it's a confusing world out there. Yeah, there's a lot going on, and I understand why you might think that this is true, but it's not. Um, and then lastly, you want to go in with your values-based interjection or intervention, and then follow up with that something else, right? An organization to follow, a resource, or some type of link. So let's move into the next slide. So I just want to give you an example of something that we see a lot. I definitely see this a lot, which is abortions are unsafe and risky. And you are risking your life by deciding to have this procedure. So some of the ways that you could structure this is actually abortion is incredibly safe. It is a very safe outpatient medical procedure. You could also think about comparing it to other outpatient procedures. So abortion's risk of complications is lower than that of a colonoscopy or a wisdom teeth extraction. You could also compare it to other related issues as well, saying, in fact, the risks associated with carrying a pregnancy and childbirth are actually higher than that of getting an abortion. So why on earth are people trying so hard to stop one of the most medically safe procedures, which is also an essential health care service? So something that I really appreciate about this response is the end. I understand the comparisons are something that are useful. I'm somebody who leans on comparisons a lot when I'm trying to explain something. It's like, well, think about it like this, or would you say the same thing about something else? So that's definitely something that's useful if you're comfortable saying that. But what I really enjoy about this response is the last, which is it is healthcare. And everything that you are going to see from us, from the Women's March, from NARAL, will be reframing it as an essential healthcare service, because it is that important and it should be that available, right? Gabriella, is there anything you would add to this?
I think this is an absolutely great response. And the one thing that I would just add is after you're telling them all of this, they're still kind of not believing you. I think, again, like what I said in one of the previous slides of just pointing out that doctors do not support these claims about abortion being unsafe. Those claims are completely removed from all of the scientific and medical evidence. And sometimes that can be persuasive, but I think, again, just leaning on our values and talking about why abortion is really important for people to be able to access and really essential healthcare should be the first kind of line of defense.
Thank you. All right, let's move to the next one. So why didn't you just use contraceptives? So this is something that I definitely see a lot from people is like, well, you could have been smarter. Why didn't you do this one thing, right? So a way to tackle this type of conversation is to say, it's not my place to judge anyone's reason for needing an abortion, and I trust people to know what's best for their lives. That being said, contraceptives are an important part of reproductive health that everyone should have access to, but they don't. And even with perfect use, contraception is not 100% effective. So, a lot of people don't have access to contraception and other forms of reproductive health care because we know that we have a broken healthcare system, right? So again, we're going back to talking about again like your choice, not questioning people's reasons, respecting their decisions, and also going back to talking about health as a whole, because again, this is about holistic health and isn't just about abortion as one thing, right? This is about being able to make the choice about your health and having access to what you need to be healthy. And that is how we should be perceiving and talking about abortion access as a whole. But Gabriella, anything else you would add to this?
No, I think this is great. I think one phrase that we use a lot at NARAL and that I think can be helpful is just reminding people that we haven't walked in this person's shoes. We don't know their experience. We don't know what's going on in their life. And honestly, it's not really any of our business. That should be between them, their loved ones, and their doctor to make that decision. And it's just not something that is up to us to judge and not something that we should be judging.
Thank you. All right, so let's tackle some questions together. And I know, Allison, you've been looking at what's been coming up.
I think you're on mute, Allison.
We're actually gonna start with Anne's question, which is really common. Why do we say pregnant people, pregnant person, rather than pregnant woman?
Yeah, I'm happy to start with this one. And I think this is just something, again, that goes back to what we talked about in the beginning about being inclusive. There are people who are trans or who are gender non-conforming or non-binary who are able to get pregnant. And we don't want to leave those people out of the conversation, especially because those are some of the people who can be most disproportionately harmed by bans on abortion. So saying pregnant people is not in any way erasing women from this conversation. We can reaffirm that women are one of the impacted groups while also saying, yes, there are other people of different identities and gender identities who are affected and harmed by these laws as well. And I think that's just really important to remind people that there's a law, like a huge part of society that is affected by these bans and restrictions. And we want to be inclusive of those people.
Yeah, and I will say we have a really great section on talking about abortion and reproductive health in a way that is inclusive for all genders. That is in our manual as well.
Right, thanks. Our next question is from Olivia. Let me answer it live. So does the Women's Health Protection Act codify abortion access protections for trans men or non-binary people?
I can also answer this one and say, absolutely, it does. It's actually in the text of the bill. It says, let me actually read it. I could read it. Oh yeah, this act is intended to protect all people with a capacity for pregnancy, cisgender women, transgender men, non-binary individuals, those who identify with a different gender, and others who are unjustly harmed by restrictions on abortion services. So the title of the bill is, in my opinion, a little bit misleading, but those people are explicitly mentioned in the bill, and those people were in mind when this bill and this piece of legislation was being drafted.
Great, thank you. And then let's see, I think we have time for one or maybe two more. Our next question is from Alex. How can we stop this legislation? Not just voting, let alone with gerrymandering, but it just doesn't feel like enough. What can we do?
Gabriella, I'm going to let you take that one.
Yeah, well, I will say I have so much respect for organizers, because organizers are the people who are really doing this work on the front line. So the first thing I would say is reach out to local groups in your area. Like, yes, we're talking about this from a federal perspective, and the Women's Health Protection Act is a federal piece of legislation, but there are also proactive things that can be done at the local level, at the state level. So I would say the first step and the thing that's really important is to just connect with activists in your community and figure out how you can talk to people at the local level, if there's things that you can do. The antis have been doing this really horrible thing of passing really regressive municipal ordinances claiming to ban abortion. So that's something that we can try to counter by organizing at the local level, and just being aware. I think that's the other thing, is sometimes these bans can just sneak under the radar, and then things like Texas happened where it wasn't really well known about that ban, and then it went into effect, and all of a sudden everybody was very concerned and there was widespread outrage. So what if we can stay informed about what's happening in our communities and our states, then I think we can intervene a lot earlier and then prevent stuff like that from happening. But I am absolutely by no means an expert organizer, so I would really point you to talk to those people in your community and in your state who are doing that incredible work, because it is super, super important. You're also a mute.
We actually have time for one more question, and I think it's really important. At what point should we disengage in a conversation that's trying to challenge a false narrative? When do we stop? Where's the line?
That is a really good question. And I know that, at least for me, I tend to get sucked into these things. So I would say that if it is somebody who you know, and it's somebody you care about, I would have a different answer to that than I would if it was a stranger, right? If it is somebody who I crossed paths with or knew at some point where I had other civil conversations with them, I might take a pause when I feel like it's getting to a point where they're completely disregarding my point of view, to the point of telling me that I'm wrong, that I should go and read a book, or, try to hang out with different people. I'm like, okay, now it's getting to a point of escalation and no return, right? At that point, I would probably just say, okay, I'm taking a break. I'll come back to you. And if I know them, maybe the next day I would reach back out and be like, hey, if you're I'd be willing to start this conversation again, but I want to be really clear that I'm not going to take any personal attacks. And, this is something that I really want to discuss in terms of the issue and our values and who I know you to be. But if it is a stranger, my general take is I usually just wait. I usually have no more than 2 exchanges. So if I say something in response to mis or disinformation I see, and they respond back and it's a question or a follow-up, then I usually answer it. And that's my only second response. If it is not a question and it's an all right sort of attack, or you're wrong, then I actually don't even do a second response. Again, this is my general rule of thumb. But when I generally feel like somebody's completely shut off to what I'm saying, that's it. Something else that you can think through is, even if you're putting something out there, there are probably other people that are seeing it. So something that you need to remember about digital defenders is, if you run into a situation where you're talking to a stranger online and you really feel like you have to say something, you can tap somebody else from this training, from this cohort, that are part of the group, and be like, hey, I'm in this really sticky conversation. does one of you want to help me out, or does any, do you have advice? Like that's literally what we're there for. So.
Yeah, I think that's right. And that the only thing I would add is just like, we don't need to be going and like hunting people out with super extreme views. Like trying to talk to those people is probably not going to change them at all. So I think if you're like, it's different when it's a friend or family member. And I think you should absolutely try to be proactive and engaging with those conversations. But instead of engaging with somebody who is just super, super far to the extreme on the spectrum, I think instead of engaging that person, it's like maybe what you can do in response is just post something proactive on your own page that's completely separate from what that person is doing or saying.
Great. Thank you everyone for asking your questions. Thank you to Gabriella and Nor for answering them so eloquently. And now we're actually going to move into our wrapping up section and housekeeping on how we can stay as engaged digital defenders. So I'm about to screen share the brand new website. It's really exciting. It's where you can have access to all the toolkits, all the past training videos now that you are trained digital defenders. And you'll also be able to have access to the Digital Defender Facebook, where you can interact with your peers. If you have questions, if you see a tweet you don't really know how to respond to, that's where you're going to go. So I'm going to show you the brand new website. Let's see. And just for the record, I cannot see the chat. So if you are asking questions about the page that you're seeing, I can't see it. So I'll get to it in a moment. So the website is womensmarch.com/digital defenders. And I'll put that in the chat. You will get the password in an email after the training. So don't worry if it says password protected. We just want to make sure that there are no trolls getting into our website and using our resources. So this is a complete resource guide where you can have access to explaining the different topics that we've had disinformation trainings on, different hashtags to follow, and the 3 main toolkits that you will be using. If you want to peruse the election authoritarian disinformation, I would highly recommend it. They overlap very easily with abortion disinformation, but your go-to is going to be the abortion disinformation. And then below we have all of our previous training videos right here. So we had an abortion disinformation training from last week, so that video is already up. We have our election disinformation training if you want to get familiar, refresh as the election seasons come on. And then we have past ones from 2020. And then below is the super fun and exciting part, all the graphics. So all of these are specially made for digital defenders for Women's March, and they're all here and downloadable and clickable. So let's say I really like this one. You don't have to justify your abortion to anyone, or We Heart Planned Parenthood, something that has to do with repro rights, since that's the field that we're in right now. I can just click on it. It'll pop up. And so you'll see on the right, whether you have an Android, whether you're using a Mac, whether you're using a PC, that down arrow always means download. So you're going to just click on it. And now you have the GIF, and you can post it on Twitter. You can post it on Instagram stories. You can do different things with it. So that's what this whole section is, just lots and lots and lots of graphics that are specifically made for us digital defenders, organized by different sections. So that's the page. And so if I click on our toolkit, this is the toolkit. So this toolkit has everything you'll need when it comes to messaging, explaining yourself in the chat, and explaining yourself in comment sections, everything you're going to need. And it's organized on the left in an outline for you to see all the different chapters and titles. So let's keep scrolling. Different ways to engage with positive comments or negative comments like trolls. Similar in the same kind of energy of, when do I stop? When is it appropriate? When is it not? Similar to Nora's answer. How to navigate these conversations online, because it is kind of stressful to see troll comments, and how do we personally feel about that. And really important, as Gabriella had mentioned earlier, language to avoid when talking about abortion, things that we're learning for the first time. Why do we say pregnant person? Why do we avoid pro-life? Why do we say anti-choice? And as you keep scrolling, lots and hashtags. A lot of you actually in the chat and your Q&A had asked, who do we follow? Who should we look into? These are all fantastic resources, especially since some of them are local for you to check out. And then this is our new section in our toolkit that we've never had before, which is fantastic, that Gabriella has completely reworked. It's all current events that are happening in the United States around, I guess it's not that exciting considering what's happening, but it is pretty great that we have a section for it. So based on the states that are actually being targeted the most right now. And so it completely explains what's going on in the news, it completely explains the current status and what we're trying to do in order to regain our abortion access and reproductive rights. And then this is our little blurb about Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization, that if you want more of a refresher, definitely go to the national section and you can understand what's going on. And then again, this is the graphic section. They're also available here if you want to see them laid out differently. This is just a little explainer of, can you post this on Twitter? Can you post a GIF on Instagram? Can you like upload a video? Just because I know sometimes it can be so confusing when there's a million GIFs and images, you want to have a simple chart that just makes it so easy for everyone to understand. And every single graphic. So the still graphics, the GIFs are the ones that move, different ones that we've had in the past. They're all right here. And then I'll go see on the left side, I can click on it if I go to proactive value-based statements. So we talked about earlier versus being on the offense versus being on the defense. So these are on the offensive. We're being proactive with our messaging, and they're broken down into even smaller subcategories of agency and personal freedom, control, justice, care and compassion, dignity, health, and our new section, the world we want to create. So these are all, you know, maybe you'll see a certain tweet, and rather than responding directly to it, you want to proactively have a tweet of your own that says having access to abortion is having freedom. And that's something that maybe your best friend from elementary school sees and thinks that's interesting, something she can connect with. And then our reactive statements is more on the defensive side. So this on the left side highlighted in yellow are common themes that you're going to see with abortion disinformation narratives. So on the left side, we have, if you're not ready to have a kid, don't have sex. We see that all the time. So on the right side are two different bullet point options of how you could respond, copy and paste, or maybe edit it to fit your language and your narrative style. And so those are our reactive statements of things you'll unfortunately commonly see everywhere. And then we'll keep scrolling. There's a lot of information. These are different kinds of comments you might see. Sometimes you'll get a bot account. Sometimes you'll get kind of things that are not related to abortion, but just disinformation in general. And then the very last section is actually our Facebook and community agreements and norms. So it's really important that we are respectful of each other and we don't share or sell private information about each other on our Facebook as we collaborate and understand the current disinformation abortion narratives. So this is the toolkit. Feel free to peruse, copy and paste, edit in your own, social media sections, however you feel, applies to you in your life, but definitely give it a look. It will be updated every day. At the top, there's a little date that says when's the last time we updated it. And you can see all the up-to-date messaging guides every single day. And then the last thing I'll get into is actually the Facebook. So it's really important that we engage with each other and help each other out when we feel confused, when we see an Instagram story that maybe feels a little uncomfortable or feels like we don't know how to answer this, or this is my best friend, like how do I tell them about this? And this is where we would go. So I can drop this in the chat as well. Actually, groups. So if you are on the facebook.com/Women's March Digital Defenders, this is what you'll see. So this is a public page that we have for everybody. Everyone in the world can see this page, but what they can't see are the specific private groups, which I will drop in the chat now. You have to be admitted by me into that group. And so right now you are a trained digital defender, so you can join the digital defender group and you can join the abortion defenders group. So these are the two groups that you've actually just become part of. And so you can join them. Here, let me switch to this profile. You can join it and you can see other profiles and other people that are also digital defenders and you can engage with them. So I'm going to go into our Digital Defenders General group. And so this is where we collaborate. This is where we help each other out. This is where we share different information, different GIFs that pop up. So this is a brand new GIF that actually got released today. And I thought it was interesting to share. And then we can see here that Megan had a question about a march on Saturday and was a little nervous about a protest and asked her question there. And that's the kind of collaborative space that you want to be a part of for digital defenders. So the way to join the Facebook is by signing the pledge. All of you received it in your original invitation. So make sure you sign your agreement if you want to be part of the Facebook and have access to up-to-date, let's say I'll edit the toolkit with something specific. Let's say there's a brand new graphic and you want to know exactly which graphic is the brand new one. definitely would recommend joining the Facebook for Digital Defenders. But that is all of our resources. So we have our toolkit, we have the training videos, we have the website, and we have the Facebook for collaborating with your peers. So I'm going to stop sharing so I can see some of your questions in the Q&A, but please drop them while we have about 4 more minutes to answer any questions. Let's see what you got. You will get the password in an email after the training. So we just want to make sure that we vet everybody, that everyone signs the Digital Defender agreement. Again, it's just promising, that this is a committed volunteer activity. You don't bail on the soup kitchen. You're really engaged with the people that you are working with, and that you also respect them publicly, that we talk to each other, again, in the same way that we are accessible with our language, in the same way that we don't shame anyone for not knowing everything. It's really important that we read the entire agreement and understand the community that we're building on Facebook. Let's see, let me drop in the Facebook one more time just so people can see it.
Allison, one question that I see in there is, what if we don't have Facebook? And that's totally fine. I mean, once you sign the pledge, you will still get, we'll not only be able to add you to Facebook, but you'll also get the password to the website, which has the toolkit on it. So you'll still be able to use everything that you learn here. Don't feel discouraged if you don't have a Facebook. It's just a good way for us to connect.
Yeah.
I will also say I do not personally have a Facebook, and the only social media I have is Twitter, but there's still plenty to do on Twitter. So if you do have a Twitter account or some other social media, that's other areas you could use.
Let's see. Okay, so I'm seeing some questions about the agreement, the pledge. You should have received it in a subject that says invitation. If not, no worries. You can email digitaldefenders@womensmarch.com. The same person that's been emailing you, the same email that's been coming to you about reminding you. So just feel free to email that and I can send you the pledge. Also, again, after the training, I will resend all of the important links that you need. So don't stress, don't worry. But that seems to be everybody. Great.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much. It was such a pleasure having you all here with us for this hour and 15 minutes. I hope that you learned a lot. I hope that these lessons are applicable to your own conversations online and offline. And for those of you that are going to be out rallying this weekend in over 600 places around the country, more power to you, and be safe. And thank you so much for your continued work on behalf of all of us. And we really appreciate you. So thank you. And thank you, Gabriella, especially for your collaboration and expertise.
Thanks to you guys for having me, and thanks everyone for coming.
Good night, everybody.
Good night, everyone.